Right now, as you're listening to this, you're carrying around an entire universe of characters you've never met. A tyrant, a sage, a trickster, a hero you're too afraid to become. They live in you, inherited from millions of years of human experience, waiting in the shadows of your mind. And the tragedy is, most people will die without ever meeting them. Carl Jung discovered something that would make Freud abandon him, that would get him labeled as mystical and unscientific. But that might be the most important psychological insight of the 20th century. He discovered that we are not individuals. We are walking ecosystems of ancient patterns, primordial images, and inherited wisdom that shapes everything we do. Yet we remain completely unconscious of it. Jung was born in 1875 in Switzerland, the son of a pastor who'd lost his faith, but kept preaching. From childhood, he felt split between two personalities. What he called personality number one, the ordinary schoolboy, and personality number two, an old man who belonged to the 18th century. This fracture in his own psyche would become the foundation of his life's work. He trained as a psychiatrist and began working at the Bergallsli Psychiatric Hospital, where he developed word association experiments that revealed how complexes, emotionally charged clusters of ideas, controlled behavior beneath conscious awareness. When he met Sigmund Freud in 1907, they talked for 13 hours straight. Freud saw Jung as his crown prince, the heir to psychoanalysis. But Jung couldn't accept Freud's reduction of everything to sexuality. The unconscious, Jung sensed, was far stranger and more profound than even Freud imagined. When Jung finally broke from Freud in 1913, he didn't just lose a mentor. He lost his mind. Or so it seemed. He began experiencing visions, hearing voices, feeling like he was on the edge of psychosis. But instead of running from this psychological breakdown, Jung did something radical. He decided to go deeper. He started writing down his fantasies, painting his visions, engaging in conversations with figures that emerged from his unconscious. This period, which he later called his confrontation with the unconscious, became the experimental ground for his most revolutionary idea, the collective unconscious. Freud had already established the concept of the personal unconscious, that realm of repressed memories, forgotten experiences, and suppressed desires unique to each individual. But Jung discovered something beneath this personal layer. He noticed that his patients, regardless of their backgrounds, kept producing the same images in their dreams and fantasies. A woman who knew nothing of mythology would dream of symbols that appeared in ancient Sumerian texts. A farmer with no education would have visions identical to medieval alchemical illustrations. Children would draw pictures containing symbols they couldn't possibly have learned. This wasn't coincidence. Jung realized that beneath our personal unconscious lies something far older and more universal, a collective unconscious shared by all humanity. This isn't a mystical concept, though it sounds mystical. It's an evolutionary inheritance. Just as we inherit physical structures like opposable thumbs and binocular vision, we inherit psychological structures. The collective unconscious is the psychological sediment of our species' entire history, the mental equivalent of our DNA. Think about it this way. When a spider spins a web, it doesn't learn how from spider school. The pattern is built into its nervous system. When a bird migrates thousands of miles to a place it's never been, it's following an inherited map. Humans have these built-in patterns too, but ours are psychological. We inherit predispositions to form certain images, to respond to certain situations in patterned ways, to organize our experience according to universal templates. Jung called these templates archetypes. An archetype is not a specific image or idea. It's more like a gravitational field that pulls our thoughts and behaviors into familiar patterns. It's a form without content, waiting to be filled in by our individual experiences and culture. You've never seen an archetype directly. You can't. They exist at a level below images. But you've seen their effects everywhere. Every story you've ever loved, every person you've been irrationally drawn to or repulsed by, every moment when you've felt connected to something larger than yourself, that's the archetypes at work. Let's start with the most important one, the self. The self, in Jung's system, isn't what you normally think of as yourself. Your ego, your everyday sense of I. That's just the tip of the iceberg. The self is the totality of your being, conscious and unconscious, personal and collective. everything you are and everything you could become. It's the organizing center of the psyche, the architect drawing the blueprint for who you're meant to be. The self often appears in dreams and visions as mandalas, those circular designs with a center point that appear in every culture on earth, or as divine figures, wise old men or women, glowing children, or images of wholeness like the golden flower in Chinese alchemy or the Christian symbol of Christ. When you feel moments of profound meaning, when everything seems to click into place, when you touch something transcendent, you're brushing up against the self. But here's the uncomfortable truth. You're not living from yourself. You're living from your persona. The persona is the mask you wear to meet the demands of society. It's the professional face you put on at work, the role you play in your family, the image you project on social media. The word comes from the Latin for the masks actors wore in ancient theater. Your persona is necessary. You can't function in society without one. But the danger is when you mistake your persona for your true self, when you become so identified with your role that you forget there's a person behind the mask. This is why midlife crises happen. Someone spends 30 years building a perfect persona, successful lawyer, devoted parent, pillar of the community, and then one day they look in the mirror and realize they have no idea who they are. They've been playing a part so long they've lost touch with their actual being. The self is knocking, demanding to be recognized, and the persona is cracking. Then there's the shadow. If the persona is everything you want to be seen as, the shadow is everything you don't want to be seen as. It's the repository of all the qualities you've rejected, suppressed, and denied in yourself. Your anger, your selfishness, your lust, your weakness, your creative wildness. Anything that didn't fit the image you were trying to project gets thrown into the shadow. But here's what makes the shadow so dangerous and so valuable. It doesn't just contain your negative qualities. It contains everything you've repressed, including your greatest potentials. That courage you're too afraid to access. It's in your shadow. That creativity that seems improper or impractical. Shadow. That passion that doesn't fit your respectable image. Shadow. The shadow contains tremendous energy, and when you refuse to acknowledge it, that energy doesn't disappear. It leaks out sideways. You see your shadow most clearly in your projections. Whatever you hate most intensely in others, whatever triggers you disproportionately, that's usually your shadow staring back at you. The person who can't stand aggressive people is often repressing their own aggression. The one who's disgusted by sexuality is fleeing from their own sexual nature. The one who despises weakness has banished their own vulnerability to the shadow realm. Jung said, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." When you refuse to acknowledge your shadow, it grows stronger in the darkness. It possesses you from within. You become the thing you most despise, acting it out unconsciously while maintaining your innocent self-image. The only way to defang the shadow is to turn and face it, to admit, yes, that's in me too. Now we come to perhaps Jung's most controversial discovery, the anima and animus. Every man, Jung said, carries within him an unconscious feminine side called the anima. Every woman carries an unconscious masculine side called the animus. This has nothing to do with being gay or straight, and it's not about gender stereotypes. It's about the fact that we're all human beings, and human consciousness contains both poles of experience. The anima in a man represents his capacity for relationship, emotion, intuition, and connection to the unconscious. She appears in his dreams as women, often mysterious, seductive, or numinous figures. She's the muse who inspires his creativity, but also the mood that possesses him when he becomes irrational and touchy. When a man is disconnected from his anima, he becomes rigid, emotionally dead, unable to relate deeply. When he's possessed by her, he becomes moody, oversensitive, lost in feelings. The animus in a woman represents her capacity for focused consciousness, rational thinking, spiritual aspiration, and taking a stand. He appears in her dreams as men, sometimes as a group of male figures representing collective opinions. He's the inner voice that gives her conviction and courage, but also the harsh critic that tears her down with absolute judgments. When a woman is disconnected from her animus, she lacks direction and can't assert herself. When she's possessed by him, she becomes opinionated, rigid, and dogmatic. The crucial thing Jung discovered is that we tend to project our anima or animus onto people we fall in love with. That overwhelming fascination you feel, that sense that this person completes you, that's often your own unconscious opposite sex side staring back at you. This is why falling in love feels so magical and why relationships become so difficult. You're not really relating to the actual person. You're relating to your own inner figure that you've projected onto them. As the relationship develops, the projection gradually fades. You start seeing the real person instead of your anima or animus, and often this is when people say, "You've changed. You're not the person I fell in love with." But the person didn't change. Your projection lifted. Real love begins when you can relate to the actual human being instead of your own inner image. These archetypes, the self, the persona, the shadow, the anima and animus, they're not just abstract concepts. They're living forces in your psyche right now. They're why you feel drawn to certain stories and symbols. They're why you keep repeating the same relationship patterns. They're why certain images in dreams or art stop you in your tracks with a feeling of recognition you can't explain. Jung found these same archetypal patterns everywhere he looked. In fairy tales and myths, in religious symbolism, in the hallucinations of psychotic patients, in the dreams of children, in the art of every culture. The hero who goes on a journey, the wise old man who gives guidance, the great mother who nurtures and devours, the trickster who disrupts and transforms. These aren't just stories. They're the deep grammar of human experience, the operating system running beneath all our individual software. And here's the truly radical part. Jung believed these archetypes don't just influence us. They're trying to communicate with us. The unconscious isn't just a basement where we throw our psychological garbage. It's an intelligence, older and in many ways wiser than our conscious ego. It's constantly sending us messages through dreams, through symptoms, through the people and situations we attract into our lives. The question is whether we're listening. One of Jung's most practical and influential contributions to psychology came from a simple observation. People are fundamentally different in how they orient themselves to the world. Not better or worse, not more or less evolved, just different. And these differences aren't random. They follow predictable patterns. This insight led to his theory of psychological types, published in 1921, a system so powerful it's still shaping how we think about personality a century later. The foundation of Jung's type theory rests on a fundamental distinction: introversion versus extroversion. Now, you think you know what these words mean. You probably think introverts are shy and like to stay home, while extroverts are outgoing party people. But Jung meant something far more profound and strange. For Jung, introversion and extroversion describe the direction of your psychic energy, the fundamental orientation of your consciousness. The extrovert's energy flows outward toward objects, toward the external world. Their interest naturally gravitates to people, events, things outside themselves. They're energized by external stimulation. They think out loud, process by engaging with the world, and they tend to act first and reflect later. The extrovert takes their cues from their environment. They're tuned to what's happening around them. The introvert's energy flows inward toward the subject, toward their own internal world. Their interest naturally gravitates to thoughts, feelings, and inner experiences. They're drained by too much external stimulation and need to retreat to recharge. They process internally before acting, reflect first, and then engage with the world. The introvert takes their cues from within. They're tuned to their own reactions and subjective experience. Here's the key. This isn't about social skills or confidence. You can be a shy extrovert who still gets their energy from being around people. You can be a confident introvert who can work a room, but needs 3 days alone to recover. It's about where your consciousness naturally lives, where your libido, your psychic energy, wants to go. And here's where it gets interesting. Jung believed that everyone is born with a natural orientation, either introverted or extrovert. This is your dominant attitude. But you also have the opposite attitude in your unconscious. If you're a natural extrovert, there's an introverted side of you that you've repressed. If you're a natural introvert, there's an extrovert side lurking in your shadow. And throughout life, particularly in the second half, You're called to develop and integrate your inferior attitude. But introversion and extroversion were just the beginning. Jung identified 4 fundamental psychological functions, 4 different ways that consciousness operates, for different modes of engaging with reality. These are thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. And everyone has a dominant function that shapes their entire approach to life. Thinking is the function of logical analysis and objective judgment. When you're using the thinking function, you're asking, is this true or false? Does this make logical sense? You're stepping back from personal feelings to evaluate something objectively. You're looking for principles, trying to understand how things work, organizing information into coherent systems. The thinking type navigates life through logic and analysis. Feeling is the function of evaluation and subjective judgment. Now, Jung didn't mean emotions or sentimentality. Feeling, in his system, is a rational function, just like thinking, but it operates by a different logic. When you're using the feeling function, you're asking, is this good or bad? What is this worth to me? You're making value judgments based on personal significance. You're tuned to harmony, relationship, what matters on a human level. The feeling type navigates life through values and personal significance. Here's the crucial thing. Thinking and feeling are both rational functions. They both involve judgment and evaluation. Thinking judges by impersonal logic. Feeling judges by personal value. They're opposite, but equal ways of making sense of the world. Most people are stronger in one and weaker in the other. Then you have the 2 irrational functions, and Jung meant irrational not as crazy, but as not based on judgment. These are perception functions. Sensation and intuition are about how you take in information, not how you evaluate it. Sensation is the function of concrete, tangible perception. When you're operating from sensation, you're fully present to what's actually here right now. You notice details, textures, colors, sounds. You're grounded in physical reality. You trust what you can see, hear, touch, taste, smell. You're practical, realistic, focused on facts and immediate experience. The sensation type lives in the present moment and trusts what's real and verifiable. Intuition is the function of abstract, imaginative perception. When you're operating from intuition, you're picking up on patterns, possibilities, implications, the hidden connections between things. You see what could be rather than what is. You trust hunches and insights that come from you don't know where. You're future-oriented, imaginative, focused on potential and meaning. The intuition type lives in possibilities and trusts the invisible patterns they sense beneath the surface. Sensation and intuition are opposites. The sensation type thinks the intuitive is impractical and lost in fantasy. The intuitive type thinks the sensation type is boring and can't see the bigger picture. And like with thinking and feeling, everyone leans more heavily on one while the opposite function remains underdeveloped in the unconscious. Now here's where Jung's system becomes really sophisticated. You don't just have a dominant attitude, introversion or extroversion. You also have a dominant function, one of these 4. And your dominant function operates in your dominant attitude. This creates 8 possible psychological types. The introverted thinking type lives in the world of abstract logic and theoretical systems. They're the philosophers and theoretical scientists, endlessly refining their internal models of how things work. They can seem detached, lost in thought, indifferent to people and social expectations. Their feeling function is inferior, pushed into the unconscious, so their personal relationships often suffer. They may have brilliant insights about the cosmos, but can't figure out how to connect with another human being. The extrovert thinking type lives in the world of objective facts and efficient systems. They're the engineers, managers, and scientists who excel at organizing the external world according to logical principles. They're decisive, practical, focused on getting results, but their feeling side is underdeveloped. They can be harsh, insensitive to others' feelings, ruthlessly logical when a situation calls for human warmth. The introverted feeling type lives in a rich inner world of values and emotional depth. They have strong convictions about what matters, but may struggle to articulate them. They seem quiet, reserved, hard to read, but beneath the surface they're experiencing intense feeling. Their thinking function is inferior, so they can be illogical when trying to explain themselves, and others may dismiss them as overly sensitive. But they have access to profound depth of feeling. The extrovert feeling type lives in harmony with collective values and social atmosphere. They're warm, engaging, excellent at creating pleasant environments and making people comfortable. They know just what to say, how to maintain harmony, what's appropriate to the situation. But their thinking side is underdeveloped. They can be overly concerned with appearances, struggle with impersonal logic, take everything personally. The introverted sensation type lives fully in their subjective sensory experience. They have rich inner sensations, intense awareness of their bodily states and subjective impressions. They may seem stolid and practical on the outside, but internally they're experiencing vivid sense impressions. They're deeply affected by their environment, but in a subjective, personal way. Their intuition is inferior, so they can miss the bigger picture, get stuck in details. The extrovert sensation type lives fully in concrete, objective reality. They're present, engaged with the actual world, responsive to immediate stimuli. They're often athletic, pleasure-seeking, realistic, and pragmatic. They live in the now and trust what they can directly experience. But their intuition is inferior. They miss subtle implications, can't see long-term consequences, struggle with abstract meaning. The introverted intuitive type lives in the realm of inner visions and unconscious possibilities. They're the mystics, prophets, and visionary artists, perceiving patterns and meanings invisible to others. They have access to the collective unconscious, and may seem weird, impractical, disconnected from reality. Their sensation function is inferior, so they're often clumsy, oblivious to their physical needs, terrible at practical matters. The extrovert intuitive type lives in the realm of outer possibilities and potential. They're the entrepreneurs, innovators, and adventurers, always seeing new opportunities, starting new projects, moving on before finishing the last one. They're enthusiastic, inspiring, future-oriented, but their sensation function is inferior. They ignore practical details, overlook what's right in front of them, struggle with follow-through and concrete reality. Now, you might be thinking this sounds like a neat filing system for putting people in boxes. But Jung would hate that interpretation. These types aren't meant to limit you. They're meant to help you understand your natural strengths and, more importantly, your blind spots. Because here's the developmental aspect that most personality tests completely miss. Your dominant function is conscious and well-developed. Your secondary function supports your dominant. Your tertiary function is less developed, and your inferior function, the one opposite to your dominant, is unconscious, primitive, and childish. But it's also the gateway to your unconscious, the doorway to growth and wholeness. The inferior function is where you're most vulnerable, where life keeps hitting you, where you feel incompetent and out of control. If you're a strong thinking type, your inferior feeling will ambush you. You'll have emotional outbursts that shock even you. Fall irrationally in love, make decisions based on feelings you don't understand. If you're a dominant sensation type, your inferior intuition will manifest as wild hunches, paranoid suspicions, or mystical experiences that unsettle your practical worldview. But the inferior function isn't just your weak spot. It's also the most direct connection to your unconscious depths. It carries the energy and potential you haven't yet integrated. The goal isn't to become good at your inferior function in the same way you're good at your dominant function. That's impossible. The goal is to develop a relationship with it, to become conscious of how it operates in you, to integrate its wisdom without being possessed by it. This is why Jung's type theory is fundamentally different from modern personality tests. The Myers-Briggs type indicator, which was based on Jung's work, turned his dynamic, developmental system into a static description. It tells you what type you are as if that's the end of the story. But for Jung, knowing your type is just the beginning. It's a map showing you where you are and, more importantly, where you need to go to become whole. The first half of life, Jung believed, is about developing your dominant function and attitude, about specializing and becoming effective in the world. But the second half of life demands something different. It demands that you turn around and face your inferior side, that you integrate what you've left behind, that you develop the opposite attitude and functions. The extrovert must learn introversion. The thinking type must develop feeling. The intuitive must come down to earth. This is uncomfortable, even frightening. Your inferior functions make you feel incompetent and vulnerable, but they also hold the key to your renewal and depth. They connect you to dimensions of life you've been missing. They make you more complete, more fully human. And this is where Jung's type theory connects to his larger vision. Knowing your type isn't about putting yourself in a box. It's about understanding the particular way you're one-sided, the particular blindness you've developed, the particular journey toward wholeness that's yours alone. Because we're all lopsided. We've all overemphasized one way of being and neglected others. And the path to psychological health isn't becoming more of what you already are. It's integrating what you're not. Let's talk about the thing you least want to talk about. The part of yourself you've spent your entire life trying to hide. Not just from others, but from yourself. The qualities you find disgusting in other people because you can't bear to see them in yourself. The impulses you've buried so deep you've convinced yourself they don't exist. Jung called this the shadow, and he believed that confronting it was the most difficult and most necessary work of becoming a whole human being. The shadow isn't evil, though it contains what you consider evil in yourself. It isn't your dark side, though it contains darkness. The shadow is everything you are that doesn't fit the story you tell about who you are. It's the disowned self, the rejected parts. Everything that contradicts your self-image gets thrown into the shadow, and it doesn't disappear. It accumulates in the unconscious, gaining energy, waiting for its moment to emerge. Think about how the shadow forms. You're born as pure potential, a bundle of energy and possibility with no particular shape. Then socialization begins. Your parents, your culture, your religion, your school, they all communicate what's acceptable and what isn't. Be nice. Don't be selfish. Boys don't cry. Girls aren't aggressive. Be smart but not too smart. Be confident but not arrogant. Be sexual but not too sexual. Succeed but don't outshine others. You learn quickly what gets you love and acceptance, and what gets you rejected. So you perform. You emphasize the qualities that work, and you suppress everything else. You build a persona, that social mask we talked about earlier, and everything that doesn't fit gets shoved into the basement. Aggression, sexuality, weakness, neediness, rage, grief, ambition, laziness, creativity. Whatever doesn't match your image of who you should be gets repressed into the shadow. By the time you're an adult, you've forgotten those parts even exist. You genuinely believe you're patient when you're actually seething with buried rage. You're convinced you're selfless when you're drowning in unacknowledged needs. You pride yourself on being rational while your emotions control you from the shadows. You think you're humble while your grandiosity runs your life underground. And here's the terrifying part. The shadow doesn't stay in the basement. It leaks out. It possesses you. You become the thing you most despise, but you're the last person to see it. The person who can't stop talking about how lazy everyone else is. They're usually avoiding their own fear of rest. The one who's constantly vigilant about others' sexual impropriety. They're fleeing from their own desires. The person who lectures others about their anger issues. They're a volcano waiting to erupt. Jung called this projection. You take the contents of your shadow and throw them onto other people like a movie projector casting images on a screen. You see your own rejected qualities out there in the world, and you react with disproportionate emotion. Whatever triggers you intensely, whatever you hate with a passion that seems too strong, that's usually your shadow speaking. The homeless person who disgusts you might be carrying your fear of your own vulnerability. The successful person who irritates you might be reflecting your disowned ambition. The emotional person who seems weak might be showing you the feelings you've buried. This is why political and social divisions are so vicious. We're not just disagreeing about policies. We're fighting our own shadows externally because we refuse to face them internally. Conservatives see chaos and irresponsibility in liberals that they can't acknowledge in themselves. Liberals see cruelty and rigidity in conservatives that they've repressed in their own psyches. Everyone is right about everyone else and blind to themselves. But projection isn't the only way the shadow manifests. Sometimes it erupts directly. You're the calm, controlled person until one day you explode with rage that shocks everyone, including yourself. You're the responsible adult until you throw it all away in a reckless affair or impulsive decision. You're the moral person until you do something that violates your own values, and you can't even explain why. That's the shadow taking over, acting out what you've refused to acknowledge. The shadow also appears in your dreams. It shows up as threatening figures, same-sex characters who disturb or frighten you, criminals, monsters, the parts of yourself you're running from. If you're a man, male figures in your dreams often represent your shadow. If you're a woman, female figures. They're showing you what you've disowned. And the more you repress your shadow in waking life, the more menacing it becomes in dreams. Now, here's what makes the shadow so tragic and so valuable. It doesn't just contain negative qualities. It contains everything you've repressed, including your greatest potentials. That creativity that seemed impractical, it's in your shadow. That strength that seemed too aggressive, shadow. That vulnerability that seemed like weakness, shadow. That sexuality that seemed inappropriate, shadow. That ambition that seemed selfish, shadow. That wildness that didn't fit your respectable image, shadow. Jung said the shadow is 90% gold. The qualities you most need to become whole are buried in the parts of yourself you most reject. This is why shadow work is so crucial and so difficult. You have to dive into what you find disgusting about yourself to retrieve the treasure that's been waiting there all along. So how do you actually work with the shadow? How do you integrate what you've spent a lifetime running from? Jung offered several approaches, and all of them require brutal honesty and courage. First, watch your projections. Notice what triggers you emotionally. What makes you react with intensity that seems disproportionate to the situation? That colleague who seems so arrogant. What quality in yourself might you be seeing? That friend who's too needy. What need of your own are you rejecting? This isn't about excusing bad behavior in others. It's about using your reactions as a mirror. If you can see it in them, it's in you somewhere, in some form. Second, own your contradictions. You're not just one thing. You're not purely good, purely rational, purely selfless, purely strong. You contain multitudes, and some of those multitudes directly contradict your self-image. Can you admit that you're sometimes selfish, sometimes cruel, sometimes weak, sometimes grandiose, sometimes petty? The moment you can say, "Yes, that's in me too," the shadow loses its power over you. Third, dialogue with your shadow. This sounds weird, but it's one of Jung's most powerful techniques. You can actually have conversations with your shadow parts through active imagination or journaling. Give voice to the qualities you've repressed. Let your rage speak. Let your neediness express itself. Let your ambition come forward. Not to act on these things impulsively, but to understand them, to hear what they have to say. Your shadow parts aren't trying to destroy you. They're trying to be integrated, to be given their rightful place in your psyche. Fourth, look at your dreams. Your dreams are constantly showing you your shadow in symbolic form. That threatening figure chasing you might be an aspect of yourself you're fleeing. That dark house you're afraid to enter might contain repressed parts of your personality. Start paying attention. Write down your dreams. Ask yourself what parts of you these shadow figures might represent. Fifth, use your imagination. Jung encouraged people to imagine the kind of person they most despise, the type of human being they'd never want to become. Then he'd ask them to look carefully at that image, to really see it. Because that figure, that imagined worst version of yourself, that's your shadow in its most extreme form. And it's teaching you something about what you've disowned. But here's the crucial thing Jung understood about shadow work. You're not trying to eliminate the shadow. You can't. You're not trying to become the shadow or act out all your repressed impulses. That's just being possessed by the shadow instead of the persona. You're trying to integrate the shadow, to bring it into consciousness, to create a relationship with it. Integration means acknowledging that yes, you have aggressive impulses, but you don't have to act on all of them. Yes, you have selfish desires, but you can hold them consciously instead of being driven by them unconsciously. Yes, you have darkness in you, but you can contain it, work with it, even use its energy creatively instead of being controlled by it. When you integrate the shadow, something remarkable happens. You become more authentic because you're not performing innocence anymore. You become more compassionate because you can't judge others when you've acknowledged the same qualities in yourself. You become more alive because you've reclaimed the energy that was locked in repression. You become more powerful because you have access to qualities you'd banished, the strength, the creativity, the passion that was hiding in your shadow. Jung believed this was moral work of the highest order. Not morality as following rules or maintaining a pure image, but morality as taking responsibility for the totality of who you are. Most evil in the world, Jung argued, comes not from consciously evil people, but from unconscious people possessed by their shadows. The person who believes they're purely good is dangerous because they have no relationship with their capacity for harm. They act out their darkness while maintaining their innocent self-image. But the person who knows they're capable of cruelty, who's looked at their own capacity for harm and owned it, that person can actually choose not to act on it. They can be genuinely moral because they're conscious. They're not pretending to be good. They're choosing good while knowing they contain its opposite. This is why Jung said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The path to wholeness doesn't go around the shadow. It goes through it. You have to descend into what you find most unacceptable about yourself. You have to face the monster in your own basement. And when you do, you often discover it wasn't a monster at all. It was a part of yourself that wanted to come home. There's a famous Jung quote that captures this perfectly. I'd rather be whole than good. He didn't mean he wanted to be bad. He meant that the pretense of being purely good, the maintenance of an innocent self-image, that's ultimately more dangerous and more dishonest than acknowledging your full humanity, light and dark together. The integrated person isn't someone who's eliminated their darkness. They're someone who knows their darkness intimately, who's made it conscious, who can hold the tension between their higher and lower natures without splitting them apart. They're not performing goodness. They're embodying wholeness. And this leads to one of Jung's most radical insights. The goal of psychological development isn't to become a better person in the sense of more purely good. It's to become a whole person, which means integrating all the parts of yourself, even the parts you'd rather not claim. The shadow isn't the enemy of growth. It's the fuel for growth. Every quality you've repressed is energy that could be powering your life instead of sabotaging it. Think about the people you admire most, the ones who seem truly alive and authentic. They're not pretending to be saints. They're integrated. They know themselves, all of themselves. They've done the work of facing their darkness, and it's given them a depth and realness that people performing goodness never achieve. They're comfortable in their own skin because they're not hiding half of who they are anymore. This is the promise of shadow work, and it's also the terror. You have to give up your innocent self-image. You have to admit things about yourself you'd rather deny. You have to see yourself clearly, without the flattering filters you've been using. But in return, you get yourself back. All of you. The power, the creativity, the aliveness that was locked away in the shadow becomes available again. You stop being a fragment pretending to be whole, and start becoming actually whole. Darkness and light integrated into a conscious human being. And when enough individuals do this work, when enough people stop projecting their shadows and start owning them, something shifts in the collective. The polarization softens because people aren't seeing their own darkness in others anymore. The moral posturing diminishes because people aren't maintaining false innocence. The capacity for genuine relationship increases because people are showing up as their full selves, not their edited versions. This is why Jung believed shadow work wasn't just personal psychology. It was the most urgent collective work of our time. Because the alternative to making the shadow conscious is that it acts itself out on the world stage. Nations project their shadows onto enemy nations. Groups project their darkness onto other groups. And we get war, genocide, inquisitions, all the horrors of history created by people who were convinced they were purely good, eliminating evil outside themselves. The integrated person, the one who's done their shadow work, they can't participate in that anymore. They've seen the enemy in themselves. They know they're capable of the same darkness they see in others. And that knowledge, that humility, that's the only real protection against becoming the thing you claim to fight. If you asked Jung what the point of life is, what we're actually here to do, he wouldn't give you some vague spiritual platitude. He'd give you a precise psychological answer: individuation. You're here to become who you actually are, as opposed to who your parents wanted you to be, who society expects you to be, or who you think you should be. You're here to unfold your unique potential, to realize the blueprint that's been encoded in your psyche from the beginning. This is individuation, and it's the central organizing principle of Jung's entire psychology. The word itself is revealing. Individuation means becoming an individual, an undivided whole. Not just a collection of roles and reactions and borrowed opinions, but a unified being with a center. Most people never individuate. They live their entire lives as somebody else's idea of a person. They fulfill the script handed to them. They play the role assigned, and they die without ever meeting who they actually were underneath all that performance. Individuation is the antidote to this tragedy. It's the process of psychological and spiritual maturation through which you differentiate yourself from the collective, from the mass psychology, from the default settings everyone downloads, and you become specifically you. Not you as a rebel against society. That's just the inverse of conformity. But you as a unique expression of the human archetype, carrying qualities and potentials that no one else carries in quite the same combination. Jung was careful to distinguish individuation from individualism. Individualism is ego inflation, the idea that you're special and different and the rules don't apply to you. That's just narcissism. Individuation is almost the opposite. It's the recognition that you have a specific task, a unique way you're meant to incarnate the human pattern, and your job is to discover it and live it. It's not about being better than others. It's about being more fully yourself. The process typically begins with a crisis. Something cracks. The life you've been living stops working. The goals that motivated you feel hollow. The relationships that satisfied you feel empty. The identity you built feels like a prison. Jung called this the breakdown of the persona, and it usually happens in the middle of life, though it can strike at any age. You look around at the life you've constructed and realize it's not your life. It's the life you were supposed to want. This is terrifying because you've invested decades in becoming this person. You've achieved things. You've built relationships. You have a reputation, a role, an established place in the world. And now some voice from deep inside is telling you it's not enough. It's not real. It's not you. This is the call to individuation, and you can ignore it. Many people do. But the price is living the rest of your life as an imposter in your own skin. If you answer the call, if you step into the process, the first stage is confronting the shadow. We've already talked about this. You have to turn and face the aspects of yourself you've rejected. Own the darkness you've projected. Reclaim the energy you've repressed. This is brutal work because it shatters your innocent self-image. But it's necessary because you can't become whole while disowning half of who you are. As you integrate the shadow, something deeper emerges. If you're a man, you start encountering the anima, your unconscious feminine side. If you're a woman, the animus, your unconscious masculine side. And this isn't abstract. It shows up concretely in your life. You might fall into an overwhelming relationship that makes no logical sense. You might become fascinated with qualities in yourself you'd previously ignored. You might experience mood swings, irrational impulses, strange new interests that don't fit your established identity. This is the anima or animus demanding recognition, and the task is the same as with the shadow. You have to develop a relationship with this inner figure. You have to integrate the opposite sex qualities that you've neglected. A man has to develop his capacity for relationship, emotion, receptivity, connection to the unconscious. A woman has to develop her capacity for assertion, focused consciousness, spiritual conviction, taking a stand. This is uncomfortable because it means becoming less one-sided, less purely masculine or feminine in the stereotypical sense, more psychologically androgynous. But Jung wasn't talking about gender confusion or losing your sexual identity. He was talking about psychological completion, about accessing the full range of human capacities regardless of your biological sex. As you work with the anima or animus, as you integrate your contrasexual side, you start to shift from being possessed by these figures to having a relationship with them. Your projections onto romantic partners begin to lift. You stop seeking completion in another person because you're finding it within yourself. This doesn't make you less interested in relationships. It makes you capable of real relationship for the first time because you're meeting an actual person instead of your own inner image. Then comes what Jung called the confrontation with the self. This is the most mysterious and the most crucial stage of individuation. Remember, the self isn't your ego, your everyday sense of I. The self is the totality and center of the psyche, conscious and unconscious together. It's the organizing principle that's been trying to unfold your unique pattern since birth. And at some point in individuation, you have to encounter it directly. This often happens through powerful dreams, synchronicities, or moments of overwhelming meaning. You might dream of mandalas, divine figures, cosmic imagery. You might experience what feels like a direct encounter with something greater than your ego. This isn't necessarily religious, though it can feel religious. It's psychological, the ego meeting the larger psyche it's embedded in. And this encounter is paradoxical because the self is both you and not you. It's more you than your ego will ever be, your deepest identity. But it's also transpersonal, archetypal, connected to patterns that go beyond your individual life. When you touch the self, you simultaneously feel more uniquely yourself and more connected to something universal. The danger at this stage is inflation, mistaking the self for the ego. People who have these powerful experiences of the self sometimes think they've become enlightened, special, chosen. They identify with the archetypal energy and become grandiose. This is why spiritual communities are full of inflated egos who think they're beyond ego. They've touched something real, but they've confused it with their personal identity. The task is to maintain what Jung called the ego-self axis. The ego has to acknowledge the self as the greater center while remaining distinct from it. You're not God or the universe or pure consciousness. You're a specific individual with a specific task, but you're in dialogue with something larger. You serve the self, you don't become it. As this relationship develops, you start living differently. You're less driven by collective values and more guided by your own inner authority. You make choices based on what's right for your individuation, even when it doesn't make sense to others. You might leave a successful career that's wrong for you. You might end relationships that look good on paper but aren't feeding your soul. You might pursue interests that seem impractical or weird. This doesn't mean you become antisocial or irresponsible. Jung was clear that individuation doesn't pull you out of the world. It sends you back into the world more fully yourself, more capable of genuine contribution. But you're relating to the collective from your own center now, not letting the collective determine your center. There's a beautiful paradox here. The more you individuate, the more unique you become, but also the more universal. You're not playing a prescribed role anymore, so you're distinctly yourself. But in becoming fully yourself, you're actualizing archetypal patterns that are common to all humanity. You're being specific and universal at the same time. Jung often compared individuation to the hero's journey in mythology. The hero starts in the ordinary world, gets a call to adventure, crosses a threshold into the unknown, faces trials and ordeals, dies and is reborn, and returns home transformed with gifts for the community. This isn't just a story structure. It's the psychological pattern of individuation. You start embedded in the collective, unconscious. You get the call, the crisis that says this isn't enough. You cross into the unconscious, beginning the inner work. You face the shadow, the anima or animus, the self. You undergo a death, the death of your old identity, your false self. You're reborn, not as a new person but as your actual person. And you return, not to fit back into the collective, but to offer what you found, to embody a way of being that expands what's possible for others. This process involves what Jung called the transcendent function. This is the psyche's capacity to create something new by holding the tension between opposites, consciousness and unconscious, ego and shadow, masculine and feminine, personal and collective, spirit and matter. Instead of identifying with one side or the other, splitting them apart, you hold them together. And in that tension, something transcendent emerges, a third thing that reconciles the opposites. This is incredibly difficult because holding tension is painful. It's much easier to collapse into one side, to be all light with no shadow, all masculine with no feminine, all spiritual with no earthiness, all individual with no collective responsibility. But individuation requires holding all of it simultaneously. containing the contradictions until they transform into something new. Jung called this the Konyanksho, the sacred marriage of opposites within yourself. When masculine and feminine unite inside you, when conscious and unconscious are reconciled, when you can hold your humanity and your divinity together without splitting them, then you're approaching psychological wholeness. You're becoming what Jung called the individuated person. And what does this look like practically? The individuated person isn't trying to be anything. They're not performing spirituality or enlightenment or perfection. They're remarkably ordinary in many ways, but they have a quality of centeredness, of being at home in themselves. They're not driven by unconscious complexes or possessed by archetypal energies. They're conscious. They don't need constant external validation because they have an internal reference point. They're not looking to the crowd to tell them who to be. They have their own values, their own sense of meaning, their own relationship to the deeper layers of the psyche. This makes them reliable in a crisis because they're not just reacting. They're responding from depth. They're also paradoxical. They contain contradictions that would tear apart someone less integrated. They can be strong and vulnerable, serious and playful, ambitious in content, rational and mystical. They don't need to be one-dimensional because they've integrated the opposites. But here's what Jung stressed again and again. Individuation is never complete. It's not a destination you arrive at, and then you're done. It's a lifelong process of becoming more conscious, integrating more of yourself, deepening your relationship with the self. You never fully individuate in this life. You're always in process, always unfolding. And it's not for everyone. Jung was honest about this. Most people don't individuate, and don't need to. They live perfectly good lives, following collective patterns, fulfilling traditional roles, and that's fine. Individuation is for people who are called to it, who can't not do it, who've been cracked open by something and can't put themselves back together the old way. If you're one of those people, if you felt that call, then you know it's not optional. You can delay it, you can resist it, you can numb yourself to it, but it won't go away. Because it's not coming from outside. It's coming from the self, that deeper intelligence, trying to unfold the pattern you're meant to embody. And it will keep creating crises, keep dismantling what's false, keep pushing you toward what's real until you finally surrender and say yes. The process is painful. You have to die to who you thought you were. You have to face what you've been avoiding. You have to give up securities and certainties. You have to walk into the unknown without a map. But the alternative is worse. The alternative is living a borrowed life, dying without having lived, going to your grave with your song still in you. Jung believed individuation was also crucial for society. A culture full of individuated people would be radically different from what we have. Instead of unconscious masses reacting from complexes and projections, you'd have conscious individuals capable of genuine relationship and creative response. Instead of collective possession by archetypal energies, you'd have people who could channel those energies consciously. The individuated person doesn't just benefit themselves. They become what Jung called a culture bearer, someone who incarnates new possibilities, who shows by their existence that you can be fully yourself and fully human, that you don't have to choose between individual fulfillment and collective responsibility. They demonstrate integration, and that demonstration is contagious. This is why Jung saw individuation as a moral obligation, not in a preachy sense, but in the sense that the world needs people who've done their inner work, who aren't projecting their unconscious onto others, who can hold consciousness in the midst of collective unconsciousness. Every person who individuates makes it a little easier for the next person to do the same. And there's something else Jung noticed. People who are individuating tend to find each other, not through seeking or organizing, but through synchronicity, through meaningful coincidence. The self orchestrates meetings between individuating people because they need each other. They're doing similar work. They can recognize and support the process in each other. This creates what Jung called a fellowship of those who bear the mark of individuation. Not a group or organization or movement, but a scattered community of people who are on the same journey, who understand what it means to listen to the inner voice even when it contradicts everything external, who are willing to be crucified between the opposites until something new is born. If you're reading this and something is resonating, if you're feeling that recognition, then you might be one of these people. You might be being called to individuation, if you're not already in the midst of it. And if so, Jung's work is a map, not a rigid system to follow, but a description of the territory you're entering, the stages you will likely go through, the pitfalls to avoid. But ultimately, your individuation is yours alone. No one can do it for you. No guru, no therapist, no system, no technique. They can support the process. They can offer guidance. But you have to walk the path yourself. You have to face your own shadow, integrate your own opposite, encounter your own self. You have to become the unique individual you're meant to be. And no one else can tell you what that looks like because it's never existed before. This is both the terror and the beauty of individuation. You're creating yourself for the first time, not from nothing, but from the pattern that's been waiting in potential. You're becoming what you always were beneath all the layers of conditioning and performance and borrowed identity. You're becoming real. And reality, your reality, is the most precious thing you have to offer this world. Every night you descend into madness. Your rational mind shuts down, and you enter a realm where the impossible happens routinely. You fly. You're chased by monsters. You meet dead relatives. You find yourself naked in public. Time collapses. Identities merge. The laws of physics dissolve. You experience this altered state for hours, and then you wake up and mostly ignore it. You might remember fragments, share the weird ones at breakfast, but you treat dreams as meaningless noise, the brain taking out the trash. Jung thought this was one of the greatest wastes in human life, because dreams aren't random neural static. They're the primary way the unconscious communicates with consciousness. They're messages from the parts of yourself you can't access directly, showing you what you need to see, what you're avoiding, where you need to go. Dreams are the voice of the self, trying to guide your individuation, and you're ignoring them. Jung's approach to dreams was radically different from Freud's. Freud saw dreams as wish fulfillment, disguised expressions of repressed desires, usually sexual. The dream was hiding something, and interpretation meant cracking the code to reveal the hidden wish. Jung thought this was too narrow, too reductive. Yes, dreams sometimes express repressed material, but that's the least interesting thing they do. For Jung, dreams are compensatory. They balance consciousness. If your conscious attitude is too one-sided, too identified with one perspective, dreams present the opposite. If you're inflated with ego, dreams humble you. If you're too self-critical, dreams show you your strength. If you're ignoring your shadow, dreams thrust it in your face. If you're disconnected from your deeper nature, dreams remind you of it. Dreams are also perspective. They don't just look backward at repressed material. They look forward, showing you potentials, warning you of dangers, pointing toward the next stage of development. They're like a psychological GPS constantly recalculating your route based on where you actually are versus where you need to go. And dreams are symbolic. This is crucial. Jung didn't think dream images were codes hiding something else. The symbol is the meaning. When you dream of a snake, it's not secretly about a penis, or your father, or anything else. The snake itself is the message, carrying meanings that rational thought can't fully capture. Transformation, danger, healing, instinct, earth wisdom. The symbol contains all of this simultaneously. Jung distinguished between signs and symbols. A sign points to something known. Smoke is a sign of fire. A red light is a sign to stop. But a symbol points to something unknown, something that can't be fully expressed in any other way. The cross, the lotus, the tree, the mountain. These are symbols carrying meanings too deep and complex for literal language. Dreams speak in symbols because they're trying to communicate things consciousness doesn't yet understand. The unconscious is ahead of the ego, sensing things before they're conscious, and it uses symbolic language to convey what rational thought can't yet grasp. This is why you can't just translate dreams into simple statements. The symbol itself is the most precise expression of the meaning. So how do you actually work with dreams in Jung's system? First, you have to remember them. Keep a dream journal. Write down whatever you remember immediately upon waking, before the rational mind edits or dismisses it. Even fragments matter. Your unconscious will produce more dreams when it knows you're paying attention. Second, don't interpret too quickly. Sit with the dream. Feel into it. What was the emotional tone? What stood out? What surprised you? Jung said the dream comes from a part of the psyche that knows more than you do. So instead of imposing meaning on it, let's show you its meaning. Third, use amplification. This was Jung's key technique. Take the main images in the dream and expand them. What does this symbol mean in mythology? In fairy tales? In different cultures? In alchemy? Not to find the one true meaning, but to see the range of meanings this symbol carries. This enriches your understanding of what the dream might be expressing. For example, you dream of a snake. Instead of jumping to interpretation, you amplify. In Greek mythology, snakes are associated with healing and the god Asclepius. In Christianity, the serpent represents temptation and evil. In Kundalini Yoga, the snake is spiritual energy coiled at the base of the spine. In many indigenous cultures, snakes are symbols of transformation because they shed their skin. Now, which of these resonances matters for your dream? That depends on the context, the feeling, your life situation. Fourth, look at the dream in series. A single dream can be obscure, but patterns emerge over multiple dreams. Jung encouraged people to collect dreams over weeks or months and look at the recurring themes, images, and situations. Your unconscious is trying to get a message through, and it will keep trying different angles until you get it. Fifth, consider the subjective level of interpretation. Jung said you can read a dream on two levels. The objective level treats the dream figures as representing actual people or situations in your outer life. The subjective level treats every figure in the dream as an aspect of your own psyche. Both can be valid, but the subjective level is often more revealing. If you dream about your aggressive boss, on the objective level it might reflect your actual relationship with this person. But on the subjective level, the boss represents your own inner critic, your harsh superego, the part of you that drives and judges yourself. Which interpretation is right? Jung would say both might be true, and you need to feel which one carries more charge, more energy, more relevance to your individuation. Sixth, pay special attention to dreams that feel big. Some dreams are just processing the day's events, clearing out mental clutter. But some dreams feel different. They have a quality of numinosity, of power, of significance that you can feel even if you don't understand. Jung called these big dreams, and they often come at crucial life transitions. They carry archetypal content, messages from the self, guidance for your path. These big dreams often feature cosmic imagery, divine figures, death and rebirth, journeys to strange lands, encounters with wise beings. They feel like more than just your personal unconscious. They feel like they're coming from deeper layers, the collective unconscious, speaking in the ancient language of archetypes. Jung paid especially close attention to dreams about death and transformation. Death in dreams is rarely literal. It's symbolic death, the death of an old identity, an outdated way of being, a phase of life that's ending. If you dream of dying or of someone dying, the question isn't, is this a premonition? The question is what in you is dying or needs to die so something new can be born. Transformation dreams often involve descending, going down into caves or basements or underwater. This is the journey into the unconscious. Or they involve ascending, climbing mountains, flying, reaching towards something higher. Both movements are necessary. You have to go down to retrieve what's been repressed, and you have to go up to connect with your higher potential. Animals and dreams are particularly important because they represent instinctual energies, aspects of yourself that are natural, uncivilized, outside ego control. A threatening animal might be a shadow quality, an instinct you're repressing. A helpful animal might be a guide, an instinctual wisdom trying to help you. The specific animal matters. A snake is different from a lion, is different from a bird. Each carries its own symbolic resonances. Houses and dreams often represent the psyche itself. The upper floors are consciousness. The basement is the unconscious. Unexplored rooms are aspects of yourself you haven't discovered. If you dream of discovering new rooms in a familiar house, that's often a sign of expansion, new capacities coming online. Water in dreams typically represents the unconscious. Calm water suggests a peaceful relationship with unconscious contents. Stormy seas suggest turbulent emotions. Drowning suggests being overwhelmed by unconscious material. Crossing water suggests a transition, moving from one state of being to another. But here's the critical thing Jung always emphasized. There are no universal dream dictionaries. You can't just look up snake equals transformation or water equals unconscious and call it done. The meaning depends on your associations, your context, your life situation, the feeling tone of the dream. The same symbol can mean opposite things in different dreams for different people. This is why Jung was skeptical of reductive interpretation systems. Dream work is an art, not a science. It requires sensitivity, intuition, willingness to sit in uncertainty. The goal isn't to solve the dream like a puzzle. The goal is to let the dream expand your consciousness, to integrate the perspective it's offering. Beyond dreams, Jung developed another powerful technique for engaging the unconscious, active imagination. This is different from passive fantasy or daydreaming. Active imagination is a structured method for dialoguing with unconscious contents while fully awake. Here's how it works. You start with something from the unconscious, a dream image, a persistent fantasy, a mood that won't go away, a symptom. You focus on it, give it your full attention. Then you let it develop. You don't direct it consciously, but you're not passive either. You participate. You watch what happens and you respond. If you're working with a dream figure, you might imagine that figure and then speak to it. Ask it questions. Listen for answers. The answers don't come from your conscious mind planning what to say. They emerge spontaneously from somewhere else. This is the unconscious speaking through the imagination. Jung used active imagination extensively during his own confrontation with the unconscious. He would dialogue with inner figures, let fantasies unfold, paint and draw what he saw. This became the Red Book, his private record of these encounters. He was essentially interviewing his own unconscious, and what emerged was a complete symbolic system that informed the rest of his work. Active imagination can be done through dialogue, but also through creative expression. You can paint what you see, sculpt it, dance it, write it. The key is that you're not creating from conscious intention. You're letting unconscious contents express themselves through you. You're providing the medium, but the content comes from elsewhere. This sounds mystical, but Jung insisted it was psychological. The unconscious has a creative capacity that exceeds the ego's. It can produce images, narratives, and insights that your conscious mind couldn't deliberately create. When you give it space through active imagination, it communicates directly. The danger is getting possessed by what emerges. Some people do active imagination and then identify with the powerful figures that appear. They think they've become the wise old man or the divine feminine or whatever archetypal energy showed up. This is inflation, mistaking archetypal content for personal identity. The correct attitude is what Jung called participating mysticism. You engage fully with what emerges. You take it seriously. You let it affect you. But you maintain your ego standpoint. You're in dialogue with these figures, not becoming them. The ego and the unconscious remain distinct while relating intimately. Jung also emphasized the importance of making the contents concrete. Don't just experience active imagination and then forget about it. Write it down, paint it, give it form in the outer world. This anchors the experience, makes it more real, helps integrate what you've encountered. And pay attention to what these inner figures say. Jung found that they often give advice, warnings, perspectives that the ego couldn't generate on its own. They know things, not in a supernatural sense, but in the sense that different parts of the psyche have access to different information. The unconscious sees things the conscious mind misses. But you also need to test what emerges. Just because something comes from the unconscious doesn't mean it's wise or good. The unconscious can be primitive, destructive, misleading. You have to bring conscious discernment to what you encounter. Does this guidance lead toward integration or possession? Toward growth or regression? Toward wholeness or fragmentation? This is why Jung insisted on the ego-self axis. The ego serves the self, but doesn't dissolve into it. You need a strong enough ego to engage the unconscious without being overwhelmed. If your ego is too weak, active imagination and dream work can be destabilizing. You need to have a foothold in consciousness before you dive into the unconscious. For some people, especially those with fragile ego structures or serious psychological issues, Jung recommended building ego strength first before doing deep unconscious work. The goal isn't to destroy the ego. It's to create a conscious ego that can relate to unconscious depths without losing itself. The relationship between dreams and active imagination is complementary. Dreams come to you unbidden, showing you what the unconscious wants you to see. Active imagination lets you go to the unconscious, to actively engage with contents that are calling for attention. Together, they create a bidirectional communication between conscious and unconscious. And this communication is crucial for individuation. You can't individuate while remaining unconscious. The self is trying to unfold your unique pattern, but it needs your conscious participation. Dreams and active imagination are how the self gets through to you, how it shows you the next step, how it corrects course when you're going astray. Jung believed that the unconscious has a purpose. It's not just a dump for repressed material. It's an intelligent system working toward your wholeness. And it's constantly communicating, sending up images and impulses and symptoms and synchronicities, all trying to nudge you toward your own becoming. Most people ignore all of this. They live entirely in consciousness, in the narrow band of ego awareness, and they wonder why life feels flat, why they feel stuck, why there's a nagging sense that something's missing. What's missing is the depth dimension, the vertical axis, the connection to the unconscious that makes life meaningful. When you start paying attention to dreams, when you practice active imagination, when you open communication with the unconscious, life becomes stranger and richer. You start seeing the symbolic dimension everywhere. The outer world becomes a mirror for inner processes. You notice patterns, coincidences, meanings that were always there but invisible to purely rational awareness. This is the symbolic life Jung talked about, not rejecting rationality or reality, but seeing through them to the symbolic layer, understanding that outer events have inner significance, that what happens to you is also happening in you, that the world is alive with meaning if you have eyes to see it. And this isn't regression to magical thinking. It's an expansion of consciousness that includes both rational and symbolic modes. You can think logically and see symbolically. You can function practically and live meaningfully. The goal is integration, holding both dimensions simultaneously. Dreams and symbols and active imagination, these aren't escapes from reality. They're entrances into a fuller reality, the reality of the psyche, which is just as real as the physical world and far more determinative of your actual experience. You don't live in the world directly. You live in your psyche's experience of the world. And if you want to change your experience, you have to work at the level of psyche, at the level of symbol and image and unconscious pattern. This is why Jung spent decades encouraging people to paint their dreams, dialogue with their inner figures, pay attention to the images that emerge from within. He knew that the path to wholeness runs through the symbolic realm, through the territory where consciousness meets unconscious, where the ego encounters the self, where meaning is born from the marriage of above and below. You're thinking about an old friend you haven't spoken to in years, and your phone rings. It's them. You dream about a specific rare bird, and the next day you see that exact bird, which you've never seen before in your area. You're wrestling with a life decision, and you randomly open a book to a page that speaks directly to your situation. You meet someone new and discover you were born on the same day, in the same year in hospitals on opposite sides of the world. Coincidence, you say. Random chance. Meaningless overlap of independent events. But what if it's not? What if there's a connecting principle in the universe that isn't causality? What if meaning itself can arrange events? This was Jung's most controversial and perhaps most revolutionary idea, synchronicity. Jung defined synchronicity as a meaningful coincidence of outer and inner events that are not themselves causally connected. The emphasis is on meaningful. Plenty of coincidences happen that mean nothing. Synchronicity is when the coincidence carries significance, when it's so perfectly timed and relevant that it stops you in your tracks, when it feels like the universe is speaking directly to you. This wasn't mystical speculation for Jung. It came from clinical observation. He noticed that his patients would often experience meaningful coincidences at crucial moments in their therapy. Someone would dream about a rare insect, and that exact insect would appear at the window during the session. Another would dream about a dead relative, and a letter about that relative would arrive the next day. These weren't occasional oddities. They happened regularly, and they were always meaningful. The most famous example from Jung's own practice involved the scarab beetle. He was treating a highly rational woman who was stuck in therapy because her worldview left no room for the irrational or the unconscious. She had a dream about a golden scarab, a sacred symbol in ancient Egypt. The next day, during her session while she was recounting this dream, Jung heard tapping at the window. He opened it, and a scarab beetle, extremely rare in Switzerland, flew into the room. The woman was shaken. Her rational worldview cracked. And this breakthrough, this impossible coincidence, moved her therapy forward in ways that months of analysis hadn't achieved. Jung concluded that synchronicities often occur at moments of transition, crisis, or psychological transformation. When the unconscious is highly activated, when archetypal energies are constellated, the boundary between psyche and world becomes permeable. Events in the outer world mirror inner processes in ways that defy causal explanation. He worked with physicist Wolfgang Pauli to develop a theoretical framework for synchronicity. Jung proposed that alongside the principle of causality, which governs how events connect in time through cause and effect, there's another principle, acausal orderedness, which governs how events connect through meaning. Not because one caused the other, but because they share a common significance. Jung suggested that at the deepest level, psyche and matter aren't separate. There's a unified reality, which he called the unus mundus, the one world, beneath the apparent division between mind and matter, subject and object, inner and outer. Synchronicity is when this underlying unity breaks through into experience, when you glimpse the fact that your psyche and the world aren't as separate as they seem. This sounds mystical, and it is, but Jung insisted it was also empirical. He collected hundreds of cases of synchronicity. He didn't just accept them uncritically. He documented them, looked for patterns, tried to understand under what conditions they occurred. He treated synchronicity as a natural phenomenon that needed to be studied, not dismissed. Modern physics, particularly quantum mechanics, provided some support for Jung's ideas. The observer effect in quantum physics shows that consciousness and physical reality interact in ways that classical physics can't explain. Particles behave differently when observed. Reality at the quantum level seems to require consciousness. The hard division between mind and matter breaks down. Jung wasn't claiming that synchronicity proved anything about quantum physics or vice versa, but he saw parallels. Both pointed toward a more participatory reality than the mechanistic worldview allowed. Both suggested that consciousness wasn't just a passive observer of an objective world, but was somehow involved in the manifestation of reality. But let's be honest about the problems with synchronicity. How do you distinguish meaningful coincidence from projection of meaning onto random events? If you're looking for signs, you'll find them everywhere. People see meaningful patterns in clouds, in license plates, in the order songs come up on shuffle. The human mind is a pattern-finding machine. It generates false positives constantly. Jung was aware of this danger. He warned against superstitious thinking, against seeing synchronicity everywhere, against treating every coincidence as a cosmic message. He emphasized that true synchronicity is relatively rare, that it carries a quality of numinosity and significance that you can feel, that it's not just any coincidence, but a meaningful one occurring at a psychologically relevant moment. The key is the emotional charge, the feeling of significance. Synchronicity grabs you. It creates what Jung called the aha experience, a moment of recognition where inner and outer click together in a way that illuminates something. It's not that you decide the coincidence is meaningful. The meaning hits you. It's undeniable, even if it's inexplicable. And Jung noticed that synchronicities often have a purpose. They tend to occur when conscious understanding is blocked, when the rational mind can't solve a problem. The synchronicity breaks through the impasse, provides the missing piece, points toward the next step. It's as if the unconscious, unable to communicate through normal channels, arranges an external event to get the message across. This is where synchronicity connects to Jung's understanding of the self. The self is the organizing center trying to unfold your unique pattern. Most of the time, it communicates through dreams, symptoms, attractions, and aversions. But sometimes, when the situation is critical and the message isn't getting through, the self reaches into external reality and arranges a synchronicity. This sounds like magic, and in a sense it is. But Jung wasn't claiming that the self has supernatural powers. He was suggesting that the self exists at a level where the distinction between inner and outer isn't absolute, where psyche and world interpenetrate, where meaning can manifest in both domains simultaneously. Let's go deeper into Jung's spiritual and mystical side, because this is inseparable from synchronicity. Jung was raised in a religious household. His father was a pastor, but a pastor who'd lost his faith while maintaining the forms. Jung grew up seeing the hollowness of belief without experience, doctrine without living connection to the sacred. As a young man, Jung had intense spiritual experiences. He had visions, sense presences, experienced states of consciousness that conventional religion couldn't explain. But he didn't become a believer in any traditional sense. He became a psychologist of religious experience. He wanted to understand what was actually happening in these states, what was real about them psychologically. Jung concluded that religious experiences were real, but they were psychological realities, not metaphysical proofs. When someone encounters God, they're encountering the self, the archetypal depths of their own psyche. This doesn't make the experience less real or less significant. The self is as real as anything in human experience. It's just not a being separate from the psyche floating around in heaven. This position got Jung in trouble with everyone. Religious people thought he was reducing God to psychology, making the divine merely subjective. Atheists thought he was smuggling spirituality back in through psychological language. But Jung was trying to walk a middle path. He wasn't denying the reality of spiritual experience. He was relocating it, finding its ground in the psyche rather than in supernatural realms. Jung studied religions obsessively. Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, Gnosticism, alchemy, mysticism of all kinds. He wasn't comparing them to find the one true religion. He was looking for the common archetypal patterns beneath their different forms. He found the same symbols appearing everywhere. The divine child, the wise old man, the great mother, death and rebirth, the journey to enlightenment. Different cultures, different languages, same underlying patterns. This confirmed his theory of the collective unconscious and archetypes. Religions aren't arbitrary inventions. They're expressions of archetypal structures in the psyche. They emerge independently in different cultures because they're based on universal human patterns. The symbols differ, but the psychological reality they point to is the same. Jung was particularly interested in Eastern religions because they seemed more psychological than Western religion. Buddhism especially didn't ask you to believe in an external God. It offered practices for exploring consciousness, for working with your own mind. This was closer to what Jung was doing psychologically. Meditation, mindfulness, the concept of enlightenment as waking up, these resonated with his ideas about individuation and consciousness. He spent years studying the I Ching, the ancient Chinese divination text. To the rational Western mind, the I Ching looks like superstition. You throw coins or yarrow stalks, get a hexagram, read an oracle. How could this possibly provide real guidance? But Jung found it worked, not through predicting the future, but through synchronicity. The hexagram you got was meaningfully connected to your psychological state, to the question you were asking. It was a mirror, reflecting back the unconscious dimension of your situation. Jung wrote introductions to texts on Eastern spirituality, but he always warned Westerners against just adopting Eastern practices wholesale. We have different psychological structures, different collective unconscious contents shaped by Western history. We need to find our own path to individuation, rooted in our own symbolic systems. You can learn from the East, but you can't simply become Eastern. Then there's alchemy. Jung spent the last decades of his life obsessing over medieval alchemical texts. This seems bizarre. Why would a modern psychologist care about pre-scientific chemistry, about people trying to turn lead into gold? But Jung discovered that alchemy wasn't really about chemistry. It was a symbolic system for psychological transformation. The alchemists thought they were working with physical substances, but they were actually projecting psychic contents onto matter. The transformations they described, nigredo to albedo to rubedo, the blackening, whitening, and reddening. These were stages of individuation. The philosopher's stone they sought wasn't a physical object. It was the self, the integrated psyche. Jung found in alchemy a complete symbolic language for the individuation process. solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate, the breaking down of old forms and creation of new ones. The Konyangsho, the sacred marriage of opposites. The death of the king and his resurrection. All of this was psychological transformation described in material terms. This might seem like a stretch, but Jung found that his patients who knew nothing about alchemy would have dreams filled with alchemical symbolism. The same images, the same processes. This confirmed that alchemy was tapping into archetypal patterns, universal psychological realities expressed through the metaphor of chemical transformation. And here's the mysterious part. Jung claimed that sometimes the alchemists got real results, not turning lead into gold, but experiencing genuine spiritual transformation through their work. Because they weren't just reading about transformation. They were engaging with the symbolic process intensely, pouring their psychic energy into it, and this created actual psychological change. This brings us to the most controversial period of Jung's life, the years he spent in what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, documented in the Red Book. After breaking with Freud in 1913, Jung experienced what looked like a psychotic break. He had visions, heard voices, felt possessed by autonomous forces. He could have interpreted this as mental illness and suppressed it. Instead, he dove in. For years, Jung engaged in active imagination daily, dialoguing with figures that emerged from his unconscious. He met Elijah and Salome, representing Logos and Eros. He encountered Philemon, a wise old man who became his inner teacher. He experienced the death of gods, the birth of a new deity, apocalyptic visions of destruction and renewal. He painted, he wrote. He recorded it all in what would become the Red Book. This wasn't published during Jung's lifetime. He kept it private, perhaps because it was too strange, too personal, too open to misinterpretation. But it was the source material for everything he later developed. The archetypes, the collective unconscious, the individuation process, all of it came from this sustained encounter with the unconscious depths. What was actually happening during this period? Jung believed he was exploring the collective unconscious directly, encountering the archetypal forms that structure human experience. Skeptics might say he was hallucinating, experiencing symptoms of mental illness. But Jung emerged from this period more functional, more creative, more psychologically integrated than before. If it was madness, it was a productive madness, a healing madness. Jung later said that everything he wrote afterward was essentially commentary on what he experienced during those years. The confrontation with the unconscious was his primary data. The theories came later as attempts to make sense of it, to translate private visionary experience into communicable psychological concepts. This raises uncomfortable questions. How much of Jung's psychology is objective science? And how much is one man's personal mythology dressed up in scientific language? Jung himself was ambiguous about this. He insisted he was doing empirical psychology, observing facts. But the facts he was observing were inner facts, psychic realities, which are inherently subjective. Maybe the answer is that Jung was doing something new, something that doesn't fit into the boxes of either objective science or subjective mysticism. He was developing a psychology of the soul, a science of inner experience, a rigorous exploration of consciousness that took subjective phenomena seriously as data without reducing them to brain chemistry or dismissing them as illusion. Jung believed we're living in a time of spiritual crisis. The old religious symbols have lost their power for most people. We can't believe in the old ways anymore. But we still need meaning, connection to something greater than ego. We still need what religion provided. And if we can't find it, we get neurosis, addiction, despair, the spiritual emptiness of modern life. Jung psychology was his attempt to address this crisis, not by reviving old religions, but by helping people find direct connection to the archetypal depths, to have their own experiences of numinous, to build their own relationship with the self. This is why he focused so much on dreams, active imagination, synchronicity. These are contemporary paths to the sacred, available to modern people who can't swallow traditional doctrine. But Jung also warned about the dangers of the spiritual path. Inflation is always lurking. People have powerful experiences and think they're enlightened, special, beyond ordinary humanity. They identify with archetypal energies and become possessed. The spiritual path is lined with wrecked egos, who couldn't handle the power of the unconscious. This is why Jung insisted on the importance of grounding, of maintaining your humanity even as you explore transpersonal depths. The goal isn't to become a god or dissolve into the absolute. The goal is to become more fully human, integrating spiritual depths with earthly reality, holding the tension between above and below. Jung also warned about collective possession by archetypal energies. He watched Nazism rise in Germany and understood it as mass possession by the Wotan archetype, the Germanic god of rage and ecstasy and destruction. An entire nation fell into unconsciousness, acting out archetypal forces while believing they were supremely conscious and rational. This is why individual consciousness is so crucial. Every person who does their inner work, who makes the unconscious conscious, who integrates their shadow and individuates, they become immune to collective possession. They can't be swept up in mass movements because they're grounded in their own center. They've met the gods within and aren't looking for them projected onto leaders or ideologies. Jung believed the future of humanity depends on how many individuals do this work, not on political systems or technological progress, but on consciousness. The problems we face, ecological crisis, war, inequality, they're all symptoms of unconsciousness, of collective shadow projection, of failure to integrate. And they can't be solved at the level of symptom. They require transformation of consciousness itself. This is why Jung saw his work as having collective significance. He wasn't just helping individuals feel better. He was trying to raise the level of human consciousness, to create more integrated people who could carry consciousness for the collective, who could model a different way of being human. Synchronicity, spirituality, mysticism, these weren't side interests for Jung. They were central to his vision, because they point to dimensions of reality that materialism ignores, to meanings that rationalism can't capture, to wholeness that requires embracing mystery. Jung was trying to create a psychology big enough to hold all of human experience, from the darkest shadow to the highest spiritual aspiration, from the most concrete matter to the most subtle spirit. And he believed that we're all being called to this work now. The crisis of meaning, the loss of the sacred, the spiritual hunger of modern life. These are symptoms of the self demanding recognition. The collective unconscious is pushing toward a new level of consciousness, and individuals who hear the call are the agents of this transformation. Whether you believe in synchronicity as Jung described it or see it as projection doesn't matter as much as the attitude it points toward. Living symbolically, being open to meaning, seeing the world as alive with significance, this enriches life immeasurably. It's the antidote to the deadness of pure materialism, to the flatness of rationalism, to the despair of nihilism. Jung's mystical side isn't a flaw in his psychology. It's the heart of it, because he understood that we're not just biological machines processing information. We're meaning-making beings who need connection to something greater, who hunger for the numinous, who can only be whole when we integrate the spiritual dimension with the psychological and the physical. We're not just consciousness, and we're not just unconsciousness. We're the meeting point, the place where all the dimensions intersect, where matter becomes spirit and spirit becomes matter, where the universe wakes up to itself through human awareness. Carl Jung died in 1961 at age 85, but his ideas didn't die with him. They exploded into the culture in ways he never anticipated. Today, more than 60 years later, Jung is everywhere and nowhere. His concepts have become so embedded in how we think about ourselves that we don't even recognize them as his. And at the same time, academic psychology has largely rejected him, dismissed him as unscientific, mystical, untestable. This is the paradox of Jung's legacy. He's simultaneously one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century and one of the most marginalized in his own field. Understanding why requires looking at what Jung actually contributed, where he went wrong, and why his ideas are experiencing a massive resurgence right now. Let's start with the influence. Jung's concepts have saturated culture. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, one of the most widely used personality assessments in the world, is based directly on his theory of psychological types. Millions of people know whether they're introverts or extroverts, thinking or feeling types, because of Jung. The language of personality itself bears his stamp. The concept of introversion and extroversion is entirely Jung's creation. Before him, These terms didn't exist in the way we use them now. He identified and named this fundamental difference in human orientation, and now it's part of common speech. Everyone knows these words. Most people don't know they came from Jung. The idea of the shadow has become ubiquitous. Star Wars, with its dark side that must be confronted and integrated, that's pure Jung. Every superhero story about facing your inner demons, every narrative about owning your darkness to become whole, that's the Jungian shadow in popular form. Writers, filmmakers, artists, they use his concepts constantly, often without knowing the source. Joseph Campbell's work on mythology, which became globally influential through books like The Hero with 1,000 Faces and the Star Wars saga, was built entirely on Jungian foundations. Campbell took Jung's concept of archetypes and applied it to comparative mythology, showing how the hero's journey appears in every culture. This became the template for countless movies, books, and video games. Hollywood runs on Jungian archetypes, even though most screenwriters have never read Jung. The whole field of archetypal psychology grew directly from Jung. James Hillman took Jung's ideas and developed them further. Thomas More brought Jungian concepts to mainstream audiences with books about soul and meaning. Robert Bly introduced men to the wild man archetype. Clarissa Pinkola Estes explored feminine archetypes in women who run with the wolves. Marion Woodman worked with the anima and body-centered psychology. An entire therapeutic tradition traces back to Jung. Art therapy, music therapy, and play therapy. These all emerged from Jung's emphasis on symbolic expression and engagement with the unconscious through creative means. The idea that healing can happen through image-making, that the unconscious can express itself through art, this is fundamentally Jungian. The contemporary emphasis on spirituality over religion, on personal experience over doctrine, on finding meaning through inner work rather than institutional membership, this owes much to Jung. He provided a framework for spiritual seeking that didn't require traditional religious belief. You could be spiritual but not religious, exploring archetypal depths without committing to any church. This describes millions of people today. Even in areas where Jung isn't explicitly acknowledged, his influence is present. The positive psychology movement's emphasis on meaning and purpose echoes Jung's focus on individuation. Mindfulness and meditation practices in Western psychology connect to Jung's exploration of Eastern spirituality. The growing interest in psychedelic therapy for healing trauma and finding meaning revives Jungian themes about confronting the unconscious and experiencing the numinous. But here's where we have to be honest about Jung's problems. Because he had significant blind spots, made real errors, and held views that are difficult to defend today. First, Jung's work lacks empirical rigor by modern standards. His method was primarily clinical observation and personal introspection. He didn't do controlled experiments. He didn't quantify variables. He didn't follow scientific protocols as we now understand them. His data was subjective. His sample sizes were small. His conclusions were often based more on intuition than evidence. This matters because it means most of Jung's core concepts, archetypes, the collective unconscious, synchronicity, they're essentially unfalsifiable. You can't design an experiment to prove or disprove the existence of archetypes. You either find the concept useful for understanding experience or you don't. This puts Jung outside the bounds of what academic psychology considers legitimate science. Second, Jung's writing is often obscure, contradictory, and maddeningly vague. He used terms inconsistently. He changed his definitions. He would make sweeping statements and then walk them back. Reading Jung can feel like trying to grasp smoke. This isn't entirely his fault. He was trying to describe phenomena that don't fit into rigid categories, but it makes his work difficult to study systematically. Third, Jung had problematic views on gender. His concepts of anima and animus are based on essentialist ideas about masculine and feminine that don't hold up well. He associated thinking with masculinity and feeling with femininity in ways that reinforce stereotypes. His view of women's psychology was shaped by the prejudices of his time. While some Jungian therapists have updated these concepts, the original formulations are dated and limiting. Fourth, Jung's relationship with anti-Semitism is deeply troubling. He made statements about Jewish psychology being different from Aryan psychology. He became president of a German psychotherapy organization during the Nazi period, though he later claimed he did so to protect Jewish colleagues. He published in Nazi-controlled journals. The full extent of his complicity or resistance is still debated, but at minimum, he showed poor judgment and made comments that are indefensible. Fifth, Jung's theories about cultural development and the collective unconscious sometimes veered into racist territory. He suggested that so-called primitive peoples had less developed consciousness than Europeans. He used colonial frameworks to understand cultural differences. While this was common in his era, it's still a significant problem with his work that can't be ignored. Sixth, synchronicity as a concept is highly problematic scientifically. The human mind is exceptionally good at finding patterns and assigning meaning to random events. Confirmation bias ensures that we remember the hits and forget the misses. Without rigorous methodology for distinguishing genuine synchronicity from pattern seeking and selective memory, the concept doesn't meet scientific standards. Seventh, Jung's engagement with occultism, mysticism, and esoteric traditions, while fascinating, blurred the line between psychology and spirituality in ways that make his work suspect to many. Was he doing science or creating a new religion? The ambiguity is both a strength, allowing for exploration of subjective experience, and a weakness, making his work difficult to evaluate objectively. Eighth, Jung's emphasis on individuation can come across as privileged and individualistic. It assumes you have the luxury of focusing on personal psychological development. For people struggling with poverty, oppression, or survival, talk of integrating archetypes can seem irrelevant or tone-deaf. Jung's clientele was primarily wealthy Europeans with leisure for introspection. Ninth, some critics argue that Jung psychology pathologizes normalcy and normalizes pathology. By claiming everyone has a shadow, everyone needs to individuate, everyone is somewhat neurotic, he arguably medicalized ordinary human experience. And by treating mystical experiences and visions as psychologically valuable rather than symptoms of disorder, he may have romanticized actual mental illness. 10th, Jung's work can be appropriated by New Age thinking in ways that trivialize it. When people talk about manifesting, attracting synchronicities, or claiming their inner goddess, they're often using Jungian language stripped of its depth and rigor. This dilution makes serious engagement with Jung's ideas harder because the concepts have become associated with shallow spirituality. So given all these problems, why is Jung experiencing a massive resurgence right now? Why are his books selling more than ever? Why are young people, especially young men, discovering his work and finding it revelatory? Why is there a Jung renaissance in the 21st century? Several factors converge. First, we're in the midst of a meaning crisis. Traditional sources of meaning, religion, community, clear life paths, have collapsed for many people. We have material abundance, but spiritual poverty, depression, anxiety, and addiction are epidemic. People are hungry for depth, for purpose, for something beyond consumerism and careerism. Jung offers a framework for finding meaning through inner work, through confronting your shadow, through individuation. Second, the rise of the internet and social media has created unprecedented levels of comparison, performance, and persona maintenance. Everyone is curating their image, presenting an edited version of themselves, living through masks. The gap between persona and actual self has never been wider. Jung's concepts of shadow and authentic selfhood speak directly to this crisis of authenticity. Third, polarization is tearing societies apart. Left versus right, us versus them, good versus evil. Everyone is convinced they're right, and the other side is not just wrong but evil. Jung's concept of shadow projection offers a way to understand this. Instead of demonizing the other, you recognize that what you hate in them is often what you've repressed in yourself. This doesn't solve political differences, but it offers a psychological path out of black and white thinking. Fourth, there's growing recognition that rationalism and materialism don't capture the full range of human experience. Purely mechanistic views of consciousness feel reductive. People are having experiences, mystical states, profound dreams, moments of meaning, that the dominant paradigm dismisses or pathologizes. Jung provides a framework that takes these experiences seriously without requiring supernatural belief. Fifth, psychedelic therapy is entering the mainstream. and Jung's concepts are proving relevant. People taking psilocybin or MDMA in therapeutic contexts often report encountering archetypal figures, confronting their shadow, experiencing ego death and rebirth. Jung's map of the psyche helps make sense of these experiences in psychological rather than purely mystical terms. Sixth, the crisis of masculinity has driven many men to Jung. Traditional masculinity is being challenged, which is necessary, but many men feel lost, unsure what healthy masculinity looks like. Jung offers concepts like the shadow, the anima, and individuation that provide a developmental path. You can integrate your feminine side without losing your masculine identity. You can own your darkness without being ruled by it. This appeals to men seeking depth and growth. Seventh, the exhaustion with identity politics on both sides has created hunger for a psychology that focuses on individual wholeness rather than group identity. Jung's emphasis on individuation, on becoming who you uniquely are rather than conforming to group demands, resonates with people tired of being reduced to their demographics. Eighth, Jung's work on dreams and symbols is finding new relevance as people recognize that meaning isn't just conceptual, it's imaginal. The image-saturated culture of memes and videos and constant visual stimulation makes Jung's symbolic approach more accessible. People understand intuitively that images carry meanings that words can't capture. Ninth, the ecological crisis is pushing people toward a more participatory, less purely mechanistic view of nature. Jung's ideas about synchronicity and the unus mundus, about the deep connection between psyche and world, between inner and outer, these resonate with a growing sense that we're not separate from nature, but embedded in it. 10th, there's a growing recognition in therapy that insight isn't enough. Cognitive approaches help people think differently, but they often don't touch the deeper emotional and imaginal layers. Jung's emphasis on symbolic work, active imagination, and engagement with unconscious contents offers tools for transformation that go beyond rational understanding. The contemporary relevance of Jung is also visible in unexpected places. Video games increasingly explore Jungian themes. Persona, a popular game series, is explicitly based on Jung's concepts. Players confront their shadow selves and integrate them to gain power. The Last of Us, God of War, and countless other games feature protagonists on heroes' journeys, facing their darkness, integrating lost parts of themselves. Jordan Peterson brought Jung to millions through his lectures and books. Whether you agree with Peterson's politics or not, he introduced Jung's ideas about shadow integration, meaning-making, and archetypal patterns to a massive audience of young people who'd never encountered these concepts. He made Jung relevant to contemporary issues in ways that academic Jungians hadn't managed. Hollywood continues to mine Jungian territory. Every Marvel movie about a hero's journey, every story about confronting your dark side, every narrative about becoming who you're meant to be, that's Jung. Black Panther's encounter with his ancestors in the ancestral plane, that's engagement with the collective unconscious. Thor's journey through loss to wholeness, that's individuation. These stories resonate because they're built on archetypal patterns that Jung identified. But Jung's relevance isn't just cultural, it's also clinical. Jungian therapy continues to help people who haven't found relief through other approaches. For people struggling with meaning, with spiritual crisis, with feeling lost or fragmented, Jungian analysis offers something cognitive behavioral therapy and medication don't. It offers depth work, soul work, engagement with the imaginal dimension where healing happens. And Jung's emphasis on the second half of life is becoming more relevant as populations age. The questions he addressed: what does it mean to grow old? How do you find meaning after worldly success or failure? How do you prepare for death? These aren't peripheral concerns. They're central to human life, and Jung took them seriously in ways most psychology doesn't. The future of Jung's influence is uncertain. Academic psychology will likely continue to marginalize him because his work doesn't fit into the empirical paradigm that dominates the field. But cultural influence doesn't require academic approval. Jung's ideas live in the collective imagination, in stories and art, and the way people think about themselves. There's also a risk of Jung being absorbed into the therapeutic industrial complex, his concepts diluted into self-help cliches and corporate training programs. Shadow work as a weekend workshop. Archetypes as personality assessments for team building. This flattens the depth and radicality of his vision. But there are also serious thinkers carrying Jung's work forward in rigorous ways. Researchers are investigating archetypal theory through neuroscience and evolutionary psychology. Therapists are integrating Jungian approaches with contemporary trauma theory and attachment research. Scholars are examining Jung's work critically while extracting what remains valuable. What seems clear is that Jung's core insights aren't going away. The idea that we have unconscious depths that influence behavior, the recognition that we need meaning and connection to something larger, the understanding that symbols and images affect us in ways beyond rational comprehension, the insight that personal growth requires confronting what we've rejected in ourselves. These truths persist regardless of whether Jung's specific theories are scientifically validated. Perhaps the best way to engage Jung today is neither uncritical devotion nor complete dismissal, but discernment. Take what's valuable and leave what isn't. Use his concepts as tools for understanding experience, not as dogma. Recognize that he was a person of his time with his own shadow, his own blind spots, his own projections. He doesn't need to be perfect to be useful. What Jung ultimately offers is permission to take your inner life seriously, to pay attention to your dreams, to work with your shadow, to explore symbolic and spiritual dimensions without abandoning reason, to seek meaning rather than just happiness, to become who you actually are rather than who you think you should be. In an age of unprecedented outer connectivity but inner isolation, of information overload but wisdom shortage, of material wealth but spiritual poverty, Jung's focus on the inner journey feels more necessary than ever, not as an escape from the outer world, but as the only real foundation for engaging it sanely. The crisis we face isn't ultimately political or technological or even ecological. It's a crisis of consciousness. And consciousness can't be changed through external solutions alone. It requires inner work, shadow integration, development of the personality, what Jung called individuation. Every person who does this work makes a difference, not by solving the world's problems directly, but by embodying a more conscious, more integrated way of being human. This was Jung's great insight and his great hope, that the evolution of consciousness happens one individual at a time, that the future depends on how many people wake up, do their inner work, integrate their shadows, and live from their authentic center, not to become perfect or enlightened or special, but to become real, to stop performing and start being, to live the life that's actually yours rather than the one you borrowed. Whether Jung was right about archetypes or the collective unconscious or synchronicity, whether his theories can be scientifically validated or not, this core message remains. You have depths you haven't explored. You contain multitudes you haven't met. You're living a fraction of who you could be. And the journey to wholeness, difficult and frightening as it is the most important work you can do. Not because it will make you happy, though it might. Not because it will make you successful, though it could, but because it will make you real. And the world doesn't need more successful people. It doesn't need more happiness seekers. It needs more real people, conscious people, integrated people who've done their shadow work and can hold complexity without collapsing into simplicity, who can be in the world fully without being possessed by collective unconsciousness. This is Jung's legacy, not a finished system, but an ongoing invitation to descend into your own depths, to confront what you find there, to integrate it, and to emerge more whole, more conscious, more yourself. The invitation remains open. The work remains necessary. And the question is always the same. Will you answer the call?